Hi everyone, it's Maestra Julia here to teach you all about decimals. So what are decimals? Well, like fractions, they are dealing with numbers that are less than 1. Now you all have just studied fractions. We studied fractions on all different types of objects, like on a pizza, on a ruler, on an egg carton, on a clock, on a chocolate bar. We even compared fractions. And with all of these different objects, no matter what we were looking at, we were learning how to break them into parts that were smaller than 1, sometimes into 6 pieces, or even in twelfths. When we're talking about decimals, though, we are looking at denominators that deal with base 10. Do you all remember when we built our Great Wall of Base 10 back in class? We started out by looking at a mat, and that was 10 by 10, which gave us an area of 100. Then continuing our pattern, we looked at a strip, which was 10 by 1, giving us an area of 10. And finally, our unit, which was 1 by 1, and gave us an area of 1. We also learned that if we continue this pattern to the left, we see the pattern continue. If we stack 10 of those mats on top of each other, we made a strip mat that was really tall. And then if we stacked 10 of those side by side, we made a giant mat. And we also noticed this pattern where it goes square, rectangle, square, rectangle, square. But what happens if we go smaller than 1? What is to the right of that unit? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at that little unit itself. So let's do that now. Let's look at that unit a little closer. Imagine that I was to take that same unit and cut it up into 100 tiny pieces. Can you see that? Now imagine if I took that unit and cut it into 10 strips. Look at that cute little strip. It's so cute, we call it a striplet. Kind of like a baby pig is called a piglet. Isn't that cute? And then if we were to take that striplet and cut that into 10 itty bitty pieces, we would be left with a matlet. Can you even see it? There it is. So this itty bitty one we call a matlet. Do you see how our pattern continues? It goes square, rectangle, square. They're just getting smaller and smaller each time. Now let's zoom in because these are pretty tricky to look at when they're so tiny. What happens when we imagine that unit is bigger and we've zoomed in? Remember that this is the unit just made into a bigger size so we can look at it more closely. It's still worth 1. And we've just drawn lots of little lines on it to imagine that it's cut into 100 itty bitty pieces. Now again, if I was to take 1/10 of that and bring it over, that is our striplet. We could say that that's 1/10 of our unit, or 10 itty bitty squares, or 10 hundredths. Then imagine if I cut that unit into 100 itty bitty squares and pulled one out. That is the size of our matlet. 1/100th. Now, how do we count up fractions on a unit? Let's look at that together. Remember, this is still that itty bitty unit that's worth 1. I'm going to go ahead and shade some of these in. Now, how many tenths of this unit do you see filled in? Let's count them together. 1/10, 2/10, 3/10. 3/10 of this unit are shaded in. Now let's look at hundredths, which remember are those itty bitty squares. It's as if we had cut up that unit into 100 itty bitty pieces. Now, how many hundredths do you see? Well, if this is worth 1, I count them up 10, 20, 30. We could say 30 hundredths. Let's look at this one more time. Here's our unit. I'm going to go ahead and shade in a certain amount. How many tenths do you see filled in now? 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10. And what if we counted this again, but this time looking at hundredths, those itty bitty squares? How many do you see now? 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. 60 out of 100 little squares are filled in, or 60 hundredths. Now let's imagine these as decimals. Now, if I take that same unit and I was to shade in these, how many tenths do you see? 1/10, 2/10, right? Well, when we write this same fraction as decimals, it looks like this. We even say it exactly the same. We would read that decimal as 2/10. Now what about hundredths? Let's try that this time. Remember, we're talking about those itty bitty squares. How many hundredths do you see? 10, 20. So we would say 20 hundredths. And as a decimal, we would write that 0.20. And we would read that as 20 hundredths, the same as when we said it as a fraction. Let's look at a different type of problem where some of these columns aren't entirely filled. What if it looked like this? Here we have some striplets that aren't filled completely, so we no longer count by tenths because some of those tenths aren't filled in all the way. I couldn't say 2/10 because I have more than that. I couldn't say 3/10 because I don't have 3/10 completely filled in. So we're just going to count in hundredths. How many hundredths do you see? Let's see, how many have we got? I see 10, 20, 5. How many are filled in? 25 hundredths. Or if we wrote that as a decimal, 0.25. Or we would read that 25 hundredths. Let's try this again. Here I've got my unit. How many do you see filled in now? 32 hundredths. That's right. If we wrote that as a decimal, we would write 0.32 and pronounce that 32 hundredths, just like when we said it as a fraction. Here's another one. How many are shaded in now? 78 hundredths. That's right, 78 out of 100 little squares. And if we wrote that as a decimal, we would pronounce it the same, 78 hundredths. But sometimes we see that decimals are drawn this way. How many do you see shaded in here? If we were to count by fives, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So we have 25 hundredths, but we could also say 1/4. If we wrote this as a decimal, we would write 0.25 or 25 hundredths. Let's do one more time. How many do you see filled in now? Whoa, we've almost got the whole thing, but not quite. You'd be right if you guessed 99 hundredths. Written as a decimal, we would write 0.99, but we would pronounce that 99 hundredths. Now, here we have 6/10. How would you write that as a decimal? Think in your head. 0.6, and we would pronounce that 6/10. You could also see this as 60 hundredths and write that as 0.60. Now let's look at one more. Here we have 2/10. Written as a decimal, it would be 0.2 and pronounced 2/10. But we could also see this as 20 hundredths, or 20 of those itty bitty squares, and write that as 0.20. Do you notice how these look very similar? There's just a 0 on the end. Why does that work? Well, I want to show you one more thing today. It's important to know your zeros when you're looking at decimals. A funny thing is that you could add as many zeros as you want on either side of a decimal. Let's look at a decimal like this, 1.36, or 1 36 hundredths. I could put a 0 here, 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 here. It doesn't change my decimal at all. It's still 1.36, or 1 36 hundredths. I could put as many as I wanted. It's still the same. Now, putting all those zeros would be kind of silly, but I want to prove a point. Now, the second that I put a 0, somewhere in the middle though, my number would be completely different. Watch what I mean. Here's my number, 1.36, or 1 36 hundredths. Imagine I plugged a 0 right there in the middle. Now my number is completely different. Imagine if I had something that was worth $1.36 compared to something that was 10.36. Those two numbers are very different. So always keep that in mind. I hope you had fun learning about decimals and fractions of a unit with me today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.